All right, let's dive into a case that really makes you question our whole idea of justice. It's a story that starts with a fight in the middle of the night, a single gunshot and a life sentence. But the most important part of this story isn't actually what happened. It's what a jury never, ever got to hear.
So who's the man at the center of this? His name is Brhian Thomas. He was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to spend the rest of his life in prison, no chance of parole. And yet, his conviction was just completely thrown out. See, this whole story begins not with a question of guilt or innocence, but with a huge question about the fairness of the trial itself. And the answer to that question comes from a pretty stunning decision made by the Louisiana Supreme Court. On June 27, 2025, in the case of the state versus Brhian Thomas, they basically hit the reset button on a case that everyone thought was over and done with.
Now, this part is absolutely crucial. The court didn't say Thomas was innocent. What they did was they vacated, or, erased his conviction. They ruled that his original trial was so constitutionally flawed that the verdict just couldn't be trusted. Why? Because they found his lawyer's performance was ineffective. So they sent the whole case back for a do-over. To really get why, we've got to rewind the clock all the way back to the beginning.
Okay, so let's go back to where this all started. It was a September night back in 2017 when a late-night visit went horribly wrong and ended in a fatal confrontation.
The entire case really boils down to just a few chaotic minutes, right after 1 in the morning. Two brothers, Deeric and Javonnie Raymond, show up at Brhian Thomas's house. A fight breaks out, and before it's over, Deeric Raymond is dead from a single gunshot. Now, Thomas never denied he was the one who fired the shot. His entire defense was that he had to, that it was justified.
So the prosecution's case? Well, it was basically a one-man show. And that man was Javonnie, the victim's brother. He got on the stand and painted this crystal-clear picture for the jury. Thomas was the bad guy, the aggressor, who shot an unarmed man in the back while he was trying to escape. And here's the kicker. The defense presented nothing. They called 0 witnesses to challenge this story.
And the jury bought it. The verdict came back guilty. The sentence was automatic, and it was brutal. Life behind bars. And just like that, the book seemed to slam shut on this case. But the real story, the one that the Supreme Court would later focus on, was all about what that jury didn't hear.
And that brings us to the absolute core of this whole appeal. It wasn't about the evidence the jury saw. It was about the critical evidence that was left behind, just sitting there in the case file, completely unused by the defense team.
The Supreme Court basically looked at the trial and said, whoa, hold on a second. They pointed to 3 huge, and I mean huge failures by Thomas's lawyer that just crippled his self-defense claim. The lawyer never challenged the state's one and only eyewitness, never brought in an expert to question the evidence, and, maybe most importantly, never let his own client get on the stand to tell his side of the story.
Okay, now this is where things get really wild. The jury never knew about the dramatic contradictions between what Javonnie said at the trial and what he said right after the shooting. Get this. At trial, he swears he saw the shooting. But to the police, just hours after it happened, he said he only heard it. At trial, he claims Thomas dislocated his shoulder in the fight. But at the hospital that night, he said he did it himself, falling off a vehicle. He told the jury he was there to pick up his child, but he'd first told police he was there to collect a debt.
And this really gets to the heart of the problem, doesn't it? The jury was only given one side of the story. They heard the prosecution's narrative of Thomas as this violent aggressor. They never, not once, heard the alternate narrative, that maybe he was the one being attacked, 2-on-1, at his own home, and that he fired his gun in self-defense.
So, you might be wondering, how do these mistakes, even if they're big ones, lead to a whole life sentence being thrown out? Well, it all comes down to a really important constitutional right that's supposed to protect every single defendant.
You know, the 6th Amendment guarantees you the right to a lawyer, but over the years, the Supreme Court has said, hey, that's not enough. It's not just about having a warm body sitting next to you in court. You have the right to an effective lawyer, someone who is actually competent in fighting for you.
To prove your lawyer was ineffective, you have to pass what's called the Strickland's test. It's got 2 parts, and you have to prove both. First, you have to show that your lawyer's performance was deficient, that they made really serious errors. And second, you have to show that those errors actually caused prejudice, which basically means there's a reasonable chance the result of the trial would have been different if the lawyer had done their job right.
And that's the key phrase right there. Undermine confidence in the outcome. The court found that when you add up all of the defense lawyer's errors here, it did exactly that. Your confidence in the guilty verdict is shaken, because the whole adversarial process, the fair fight it's supposed to be, completely broke down.
But hold on, because this wasn't a slam dunk decision. not everyone on the Louisiana Supreme Court agreed. In fact, there was a really powerful dissenting opinion that argued the majority was missing the forest for the trees.
The dissent, which was written by Justice Crane, cuts right to the chase. For him, one single, undeniable fact trumped all the arguments about legal procedure. Brhian Thomas shot an unarmed man in the back. For the dissenting justices, the physical evidence was just impossible to ignore. The autopsy confirmed the bullet entered Deeric's upper right back, it traveled downward, and it was fired from a distance. To them, this perfectly matched Javonnie's story of his brother being shot while he was stumbling and trying to run away. They also pointed out that years later, Thomas himself couldn't give a coherent explanation for how you shoot a man in the back who is supposedly chasing you.
So for the dissenters, it didn't really matter who threw the first punch. The real question, the one they felt the majority totally sidestepped, was this. How can you possibly claim self-defense when the physical evidence screams that your victim was trying to get away from you? They believed no amount of fancy lawyering could change that fundamental, damning fact.
So when you step back from all the details, this case becomes about something much, much bigger than just Brhian Thomas. It's really about a deep, philosophical debate over how we even define justice in the first place.
And really, this whole thing boils down to two completely different ways of looking at justice. The majority was focused on the integrity of the process. Was the trial fair? Did the system work the way it's supposed to? They said no, it didn't. But the dissent, they were focused on the certainty of the outcome. Does the hard evidence, especially that autopsy report, point conclusively to guilt? They said absolutely yes.
Ultimately, the majority's ruling sends a really powerful message. It's saying that a verdict just can't be trusted, no matter how strong the evidence might seem, if it wasn't reached through a fair fight. Our legal system is built on the belief that a just process is the only reliable path to a truly just result.
And that leaves us with this huge question. Brhian Thomas is now going to get a new trial. A new jury will get to hear all of it. The conflicting stories, the expert opinions, and maybe even Thomas's own side of the story. But this case forces all of us to ask, what is the true measure of justice? Is it getting the right answer? Or is it making sure everyone gets a fair shot to make their case?